the culture wars actually has an impact to the point at which it denies people their voice. Their voice and their concerns are not really taken seriously.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Frank Furedi talks about the culture wars and the relentless reframing of Western civilization in a negative light.
I think what we're seeing now is a very strong hubristic reaction against civilization, particularly Western civilization, where it seems to be argued that Western civilization historically is a story of shame, that there's nothing really positive that has really occurred. And there seems to be this almost visceral hatred for all the achievements of civilization.
Frank says the indoctrination of young people starts in school.
For 20, 30, maybe 40 years, the educational system in particular and the cultural institutions that feed into it have been miseducating young people and indoctrinating them with values that are the very opposite of their ancestors.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with author, commentator and sociologist Professor Frank Furedi. Frank, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
So you were one of the organisers at the NatCon event that the Brussels political establishment tried quite hard to cancel. Can you tell us briefly what happened and why it's important?
Well, it came as a bit of a shock to me because we had everything set up and we got this very beautiful venue called the Concert Noble. And I was called in by the director a couple of days before the event. And I could tell something was wrong because he was nervous. But he kept on talking about everything other than the event, like football and food, restaurants. And then when he said, I believe in free speech, but I knew there was a problem because whenever people say, I believe in free speech, but it's what comes after the but that's really important. And he said that what happened was that Antifa had written a press release saying they were going to mobilize against this event, and that the mayor has decided, the mayor of Brussels, that he wouldn't provide any police protection, and therefore the event couldn't go on. So when I asked him, he said, what is this really all about? Because it's the duty of the mayor to provide police protection to venues in Brussels when you have a meeting. It's not something that they do as a favor. It became very clear to me that the mayor had objected politically to the content of the meeting. And in particular, what he didn't like was that there were people there that belonged to the conservative strand of the political continuum. So this went on for a while, and I said, are you sure you're not going to change your mind? It was very apologetic, tried to change the subject, says, we'll find you a new venue, and then kind of we moved on. So then I got a second venue with other people called the Sofitel Hotel in Brussels, and everything was fine there. And the day before, literally a day before the event, they told us that pretty much the same thing happened. The local mayor indicated that there was going to be no police protection, but unlike the first mayor, this is the mayor of Etterbeek, he boasted about the fact that he will not allow people like us to have a voice in Brussels. Then I got a third venue, and thankfully here you had a guy who ran the venue, was a fairly robust free speech sort of supporter. And he worked all night, got his team together. Everything was all set to go. And then the mayor of that area, which is called Saint-Just, also decided that it's not possible to have a meeting.
This is three different mayors.
Three different mayors, yeah. But fortunately, we anticipated that. So we got told people to come early. So by 8:30, there were about 250, 300 people there. So by the time the police arrived to kind of try to close the meeting down, people were already in there. So we had a lot of arguments to and fro. In the end, the police relented for the day and then said that tomorrow the event will be shut down. It will not be able to go ahead. And then that's the end of the conference, a 2-day conference. So then what happened was we got some lawyers. We got lawyers to kind of try to sort of demand that our rights, our democratic rights be respected. Went to the judges. The first two judges rejected our demand, but finally the Superior Court relented and agreed. But this happened only after the Prime Minister of Belgium came out on our side and said that this is unconstitutional. This looks, this is not what you do in a democracy. And we think that the reason why the Prime Minister of Belgium said that was because Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, also criticized this, and they put pressure on the Belgian Prime Minister to fall in line. So thankfully, it was a great result. We won the case in the end, and now I'm going back to the courts to try to nail the mayors who essentially try to take away our rights to voice, our right, the freedom of assembly, and see if we can get some kind of justice.
Do you think this was a one-off, or is this a taste of things to come?
Well, it's interesting because I got a lawyer and I had a lunch with him, in fact, yesterday, and he mentioned to me that this is particularly frequent in the Wallonia, the French part of Belgium, where it happens all the time, where all the socialist mayors take a very hard line and prevent meetings from occurring from their political opponents. Apparently it also happens in the Flemish area, but not so frequently. But I think that this was a dry run for the future, because in June you're going to have the Hungarian presidency, and the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, not very popular amongst the EU elites. And I think that this was just an attempt to prepare the way to see how they can undermine, delegitimate, and try to sabotage that event by preventing meetings from occurring.
Right. How do we get to this point where a group of conservative thinkers, some of them quite well known, you even had a serving Prime Minister speaking, can't just get together and have a few presentations? Well,
I know it's a bit of a shock. Thankfully, I don't think that this could happen in London or even in Paris. I think that the authoritarian streak amongst the left there is very, very severe. They really believe that they got the moral authority to decide who can speak and who cannot speak. But I think there's something very, very bad has happened in Western Europe, which is that the freedom of speech, which is a foundational freedom of democracy, is now called into question in many, many venues. And people argue that free speech has been overrated and free speech must be curbed if it offends anybody. Free speech must be curbed in case it traumatizes somebody. Free speech cannot happen when you say hateful things. There's all kinds of qualifications on the exercise of free speech, particularly in the United States, but also here. And when that milieu has become so strong and the moral authority of free speech has been so strongly devalued, then people feel that they got every right in the world to prevent you and I or anybody else from opening their voice, their mouth.
Some people may feel, this is not so related to me, it's happening in Brussels to a bunch of unrelated people. And could you talk to us about how the culture wars affect the lives of ordinary folk?
I think it does. I think people think that culture wars are what happens in universities. But when you talk to people throughout Europe, they often tell you that things happen to them that they don't like, that they have not been consulted about. And that could be anything from uncontrolled migration, mass migration, when suddenly you wake up in your town and you realize that there are all these people coming in, and it comes as the news to you. No consultation, no concern about the balance of life. If you have 200 guys coming in from overseas, men principally, then you're going to unbalance everything. So you have people being worried about that. People are often worried about, for example, in Europe, about the imposition of the Green Deal, which nobody voted for. Ordinary people didn't vote to have their living standards slashed because of the green ideology becoming institutionalized in many, many societies. So what I find is that a lot of things happen that weren't the consequence of people demanding it, but nevertheless is imposed on them to the point at which people become wary. They become almost alienated from the political system. And worse still, this goes back to our earlier discussion on free speech. A lot of people censor themselves. They don't know whether they can say certain things because they're going to be punished or they're going to be ridiculed or ostracized. And very often you find people saying, I just rather not get involved in this discussion. I don't want to create problems for myself. And there's a very high level of censorship that's going on, self-censorship that's going on, which basically means that the culture wars actually has an impact to the point at which it denies people their voice. Their voice and their concerns are not really taken seriously. I think this is very important because often people say, well, Frank, the economy is much more important than the culture wars. And what I argue is you cannot separate the two. The two are really intertwined. Just go work in a corporation or just go anywhere, and you'll find that the new sort of wokish kind of rules have been institutionalized. You find that there are speech codes. You've got to behave in a particular kind of ways. You've got to look like in a certain way. The whole policy of inclusion means that there's a kind of meritocracy just gone out the window, and people are often appointed not because they're the best person for the job, but because they tick the right kind of boxes on the inclusion in the inclusion zone. So so it is a huge impact on people's life and also on their economic welfare.
So you mentioned about things being imposed on people. And this isn't like a natural occurrence. There are policymakers and people pushing these things to happen. And who are these people, and why do they feel the need to change all these different facets of our lives?
That's a complicated question because, as you know, historically, policymakers claimed to respond to the demand from below. So people wanted certain things. And policymakers would say, well, we'll deliver them. We'll try to get those things done. Whereas today, most of the new policies are not a reaction to popular demand, but it comes out of their own head. So I think that what's happening is that many of the policies are a result of the outlook, the intellectual and moral outlook of our particular cultural elites, but also the political ones. And the way they often behave is they think, they're certain that they know better than anybody else what's in the people's best interest. They have this very paternalistic assumption. And very often you know that they have this assumption because they often use the term that we're doing this to raise awareness in society. And when they say we're raising awareness, what they really are saying, we are aware, right? We are on the right side of history. We know what needs to be done. You, on the other hand, need to have your awareness raised. And you create this two-tier sort of cultural political system. And the reason why they do that to some extent is because that gives them a sense of purpose, legitimacy. They think that by being so aware, they're creating a kind of moral authority for themselves. And that seems to be how it works.
So you talk on your Substack about decivilisation. Could you talk us through what that is? And are these things we're discussing like symptoms of the decivilisation?
Yes, I mean, I think there is a process whereby civilization emerges over a very long period of time. And through civilization, you have the development of certain forms of behavior and a certain set of assumptions about what is right and what is wrong. And you have a certain kind of respect for the legacy and traditions that civilization represents. And I think what we're seeing now is a very strong hubristic reaction against civilization, particularly Western civilization, where it seems to be argued that Western civilization historically is a story of shame, that there's nothing really positive that has really occurred. And there seems to be this almost visceral hatred for all the achievements of civilization. So when you look back upon the last couple of thousand years, I cannot think of a single element within our civilization that is not put to question or criticized. So you have a situation where the Greeks are attacked for owning slaves. I mean, every society owns slaves. They're not praised for the fact that they were also democratic and they invented reading, they invented science and conceptual thinking. They are attacked as somehow the lowest of the low. Someone like Aristotle, who is in many respects the father of philosophy, is attacked for supposedly being the personification of white supremacy. I don't know how they got that. But then you go through every epoch, and the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, all these eras are attacked for being colonialist, imperialist, all kinds of different sins. So you then end up with a situation where essentially everything that's integral to our past is now seen in an entirely negative light. It's like a one-sided. Obviously, bad things have occurred in the past, and you got to discuss and account for those. But at the same time, there are all these achievements that provide a foundation that makes us sensitive, makes us aware of oppression and exploitation, racism. That didn't just happen, out of nothing. That's the result of a civilizational development. Just to give you one example that concerns me, if you look at human civilization, at its outset, everywhere, whether it's China or England or anywhere, initially you can see that human beings have not made a very clear distinction between themselves and animals. Often when you look at cave paintings and early art, there's all half man, half animal depictions occurring in Egypt or in Greek civilization. And then gradually, with the development of civilization, you have this growing separation between animals and humans, an understanding that the moral worth of human beings is quite special, quite distinct, very different than animals are. And that kind of goes in a different trajectory. Today what we have is the very opposite. There's a very strong movement that's arguing that it's speciesist to suggest that somehow human beings are morally unique and special compared to animals. There's an insistence that it was wrong to make that what they call binary separation between animals and humans. And they're now talking about the fact that animals should have rights, that we should think about animals having the right to consent. I don't know what that means. And literally what you have is the animalization of human beings and the humanization of animals. And that kind of decivilizational process is occurring in a number of different domains of culture and society.
Obviously, civilization is about the kind of now and the tomorrow, but we're looking at the history being rewritten and reframed to change the civilization of now.
It is, because what we're doing is it's almost as if the culture war is being fought out in the past as much as in the present. And the temporal distinction between the present and the past is kind of eroded. And very often when you hear the attacks on the past, you get the impression that when they criticize Aristotle or Adam Smith or Shakespeare, it's almost as if they're lashing at somebody who's their peer, as if they're living together, and they are saying Shakespeare should have written this, should have said that, and they kind of read history backwards to the point at which they spend more energy trying to fix the problems of the past than dealing with the issues that face us in the here and now.
Obviously, important to any civilization is people. And if we look at the young people of now, are obviously the civilization leaders of tomorrow. And you're thinking about the protests, the Israel-Palestine protests, demographically, it seems young people are a lot more supporting the Palestine side. Why do you think that is, and what's that telling us about our civilization at the moment?
Well, the way that I look at it is that for 20, 30, maybe 40 years, the educational system in particular and the cultural institutions that feed into it have been miseducating young people and indoctrinating them with values that are the very opposite of their ancestors. And if you look at the kind of textbooks that are written, they basically send a message that what your parents and your grandparents believed in was fundamentally flawed. That they, okay, you've been told that Winston Churchill was a great man, but actually, he was just a kind of an exploitative, oppressive imperialist. And you go back and just about everybody is kind of rewritten in that way. But as young people are growing up, they're not only being indoctrinated with these ideas, they're also being disempowered, because if you look at education, it's very much focused now on validating young people psychologically. So teachers are told not to criticize kids because it's too traumatic. Even tests and exams are seen as being a potential problem because they can create all kinds of psychological difficulties. You have a continuous attempt to emphasize the emotional side of education to the point at which we encourage young people to become internally focused. And when that occurs, it basically means that instead of encouraging their power of independence and self-sufficiency, we kind of make them dependent, and it's almost like they become patients. So, as you will have known, for example, in the United States, 40% of teenagers have seen a therapist.
Right.
That's a very large number. In Britain, the patterns are very, very similar, and it's almost like we give them a diagnosis for what are existential problems. So when young people become weak and disempowered, and at the same time, they've been educated to hate their own society quite systematically, then it's not surprising, because what binds the LGBTQ people together with Hamas is this common visceral hatred of Western civilization. So it's, I remember going to a dinner party in October, just a few days after October the 7th, and there's a few people there who are on the other side of the cultural divide from me, and I said to them, look, I know, without having mentioned a word to you, that because you support Black Lives Matter, you support intersectionality, you support all the transgenderist ideology, I bet you think that Hamas are freedom fighters. And without a moment's thought, they said yes, because that's almost like an imperceptible bond that kind of binds them together. What they call the wokish side of society and the Hamas Islamist side of society kind of gradually, effortlessly converge, at least against Israel, but not forever.
Looking at interviews with some of the young people at these events, they're asked why they support the Palestine side. And they don't really talk so much about the kind of history or the conflict, but more about Israel is the stronger side and Palestine is the oppressed. It's almost like strong is wrong, and they have to automatically support the victim. Where did this victim narrative come from, and how did it become so prevalent?
Well, the victim narrative kicked in around the 1970s and just expanded more and more. But at a certain point, the victim narrative converged with what we see today as kind of the kind of Black Lives Matter, intersectionality, all these new kind of, or more recent kind of developments. And as a result of that, what's happened is that your identity itself, the politicization of identity, has taken a very strong victim form. So historically, you could have identities of people that weren't linked to being a victim. You were proud of your British identity or your Chinese identity or your Jewish identity, not because you were a victim, but that's who you were. But at a certain point, being oppressed, being victimized, has become an integral feature of contemporary identity politics, and it's promoted in all kinds of different venues. And being in that situation actually gives you a certain kind of moral authority, which others don't have, which is why you have a situation where you watch a film on Netflix, a TV program. It's always the people who are supposedly minorities who've been victimized, who've been excluded. They're always the most attractive characters. And anybody who's just normal, or particularly a white heterosexual male, they're invariably represented as insensitive, oafish, clumsy, in relatively negative light. It's very rare when you meet in these cultural programs, very rare when you meet an attractive, smart, sensitive, emotionally literate, white heterosexual man. It just doesn't happen. So when you have that, that becomes really very, very important. I think there's something else, which is that the flip side of being victimized is the notion that there is such a thing as white privilege. And when you have white privilege, and you kind of given that kind of automatic oppressed role, that is your identity. You can't really get rid of that. And the funny thing has happened, so in recent years, the people with the most white privilege have become the Jews. I mean, they're seen as being hyper-white, they're kind of hyper-Western. So therefore, their identity has been what we in sociology call spoiled. It's a spoiled identity. It's got no redeeming features to it. It's become increasingly a negative one. But the other side of that is that a lot of people who have white privilege, and which is virtually every white person, often many of them feel that the way you get rid of that identity of having white privilege is becoming the allies of various kind of oppressed groups. And I think that what you see in, for example, the universities in America, all these protests against Israel and the wearing of the Palestinian scarf and everything else is almost like an attempt to kind of wash away your white privilege, to kind of indicate that you are really on the right side of history, not like other white people are. And I think there's that kind of guilt-driven momentum that's part and parcel of the process, which is really quite important to understand, because that will kind of continue for some time to come.
Is this coming for the young people from their education, from the universities?
Schools already. I mean, you have to remember that a lot of this stuff kicks in at a very early point in schools, so that by the time they go to university, they've been totally indoctrinated. And this is what a lot of people have missed out. They always believed that the real problem was the university, which it's a problem. But what they completely overlooked was what was happening in schools. And it wasn't until COVID, when a lot of parents began to listen in on their children having online discussion with their teachers, that a lot of parents were shocked. They realized that kids were being told about Black Lives Matter, how that's the high point of human civilization. They were being told about how there are all these multiple genders, and you don't need to be a boy or a girl. You could be gender fluid. So imagine you're a mother, and you hear your 11-year-old girl, 12-year-old girl being exposed to that. You then realize that actually education is not what you imagined. And it's only recently that people have become aware of the fact of how the curriculum in schools is constituted, how it works, and how the whole teaching profession, unfortunately, with honorable exceptions, a small minority, have become wedded to these kinds of ideals.
As well as the education system, what role do you think social media is playing in all of this?
I think the role of social media is often over-exaggerated. I mean, they get blamed for everything, depending on which side you're on. I think what social media does is it kind of amplifies the offline experience. So online, you have less restraint, and you have more capacity to elevate and inflame already existing problems. But in fact, the real problem already occurs a long time before social media became popular, because all the trends that we're discussing were in place before the emergence of social media, but they weren't crystallized in the same way as they are now. Social media, can do wonders for good causes, but it can also do horrible things when it's kind of harnessed to some negative, corrosive projects. And we should really be looking at not the social media, which is the technology, but the different people, institutions who are communicating to the rest of us. I mean, I worry as much about Netflix as other people worry about social media. I mean, when you look at all the films that come out of Hollywood, TV programs.
To go a bit more into the what you were saying about Netflix and entertainment providers there, I mean, is that like a purposeful thing, or is it just kind of like a natural progression as society moves its ideology?
It's a very difficult question, because one of the problems that I struggle with is to try to explain how is it that without there being a clear, explicit ideology, like liberalism or conservatism or socialism, somehow our cultural institutions and the people who run them kind of are bound together and end up saying very similar things without even consulting each other. So there seems to be almost a spontaneous process occurring where certain ideals become normalized and institutionalized, And in one of my books, I call this an ideology without a name. And what this ideology without a name is this emergence of two very important cultural and political developments. On the one hand, that of social engineering, where expertise and its politicization serves to validate virtually every single policy that is in town. At the same time, alongside of it, you have identity politics and the politicization of identity, and the two converge together, and in a way that hasn't got a name to it. But what it means is that, therefore, the kind of ideals that are associated with, for example, LGBTQ culture, or the culture of what they call inclusion and equity, have completely swept all the institutions of culture, from Hollywood to TV or to whatever. So when you look at it very carefully, it's very difficult to understand how it has come about that certain ideals are kind of almost spontaneously represented, that you'll have a very determined effort to make sure that you have almost a role reversal of what happened in the past. For example, you have a variety of history programs where sort of white people are replaced by black people in a way that doesn't make any sense at all. So in Sweden, the most expensive TV program is, I think, an 8 or 10-part history of Sweden. And it begins with a discussion how, in the beginning in Sweden, there were large numbers of black people. And that, contrary to what you think, Swedish people didn't look like the way they look now. So you have this complete fantasy, which is promoted without any discussion. And if you question it and you basically make the point this is ridiculous, you're then called a racist. So the very moment this happened in Sweden, we have similar things happening in Britain and America, where the pattern is the same everywhere, where you have almost a kind of a reversal of historical trends, the attempt to abolish the voices of the past and replace them with kind of more woke ones. So you have a situation where almost spontaneously what is cool is the reverse of what might have been cool in the past. The images that you get across and you promote and popularize are very, very different. So, for example, if you look at films produced in the past, they would represent man and woman in a very different ways. You would have manly men. That was like a kind of an attractive proposition. And you would have feminine women. So that was that was then. Whereas now what you've got is, first of all, a lot of ambivalence between man and woman. You have the toxification of masculinity. The idea that a guy is masculine is, by definition, a negative phenomenon. And you have this constant rewriting of the cultural script by which people live their lives. So imagine, right, you're a young kid, you're kind of growing up, you're 15, 16, and you're watching all these TV programs, you're listening to music on MTV, which more or less reinforce this kind of sensibility that basically tell you the story that the elders, the grown-ups, have messed up the world, they destroyed the world for you. You kind of create a very different sensibility than would have been the case in the past. And that's something that is, in many ways, quite unprecedented, because there's always been youth rebellions. Young people have always kicked up against their parents and against the elders, and that's normal and even natural. There's nothing really wrong with that. Whereas now, it's a very different story. Now it's not simply rejecting what the elders have said, but also to fundamentally decry and attack what their values were, what they stood for. Very different. I mean, the first time in history, which was in ancient Greece, that we have a good example of youth rebellion, they criticized the elders for not living up to the values that they stood for. Whereas us young, are going to be able to do that. Whereas now, today, it's not just not living up to the values, but the values themselves were fundamentally wrong that you possess.
Almost like the Cultural Revolution, like attack the olds.
Yeah, it's what I call the creation of a year zero ideology. So you create basically everything that happened before now is automatically bad. All its traces have got to be destroyed and rewritten. And anything that's potentially good is going to start anew. It's a very interesting kind of development. It's not like year zero in Cambodia, where you kind of obviously linked a particular ideology like communism. It's a year zero ideology that's linked to what I call an ideology without a name. You just kind of assume that it makes sense and this is the way it ought to be.
Do you feel optimistic that we can stop this decivilization? And if so, what do we need to do?
It depends when you ask me. Like on some days, what I call, I hate Frank days, I'm very pessimistic. On other days, I feel fairly optimistic. I think with a dose of realism, it seems to me that there's no such thing as a lost cause, especially because the truths and the legacies that are embodied in our civilization are really powerful. And I think they can withstand the worst attacks. They're not going to melt away. They're not going to kind of somehow fall apart just because they are not treated with contempt by so many people. So as long as they are there and as long as we're able to get an audience for them, at least a minority of people, to take those ideals seriously, it's always possible to reverse or to slow down some of the trends that we've been discussing. I can see a lot of possibilities, first of all, because a lot of young people in Europe in particular are joining this counter-revolution that's breaking out in Europe, just like they did in the 60s. In the 60s, the counterculture was against the tradition, against Western civilization. So people that rebelled in the 60s were, in a sense, the ancestors of the people that are in power now, who kind of also embody that kind of cultural moment from the 60s. Whereas today you have a lot of young people reacting, particularly in Europe, against the kind of culture that's in place in our societies, that's institutionalized. And I noticed, for example, that in many parts of Europe, for example, the young people are disproportionately represented in supporting some of these new populist parties. France, Holland, Germany, you have a very large percentage of teenagers and people in their early 20s who are rejecting the mainstream kind of parties. And so you have this almost natural kind of shift occurring, where people are looking for more meaningful answers than the ones that are provided by identity politics. I think a lot depends on people like my friends and other intellectuals who are able to give a counter-narrative, an account of civilization that can challenge the dominant narrative that exists and bring about a kind of a situation where these can be debated and argued in a kind of explicit kind of a way. So on balance, I remain realistic, which means that it is possible to reverse those, but it's not going to happen anytime soon or easily. But we just got to not censor ourselves and be a little bit more courageous than we've been until now. And the final point on this is especially something that my conservative friends have been guilty of. If you look at last 30 years, they've always reacted to the latest attack on their way of life. So they kind of adopted the politics of the backlash, where you kind of react to what has gone on beforehand. But the trouble is that when you simply react, you never take the initiative. And therefore, what I argue that needs to happen is that rather than reacting to the latest letter in the LGBTQ alphabet and say that it's ridiculous. We got to initiate our own independently worked out intellectual and moral outlook that we kind of promote. And it's the taking of the initiative rather than just simply reacting in the way that's been the case in the past that's going to win us a victory in the culture wars.
Frank Furedi, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.